This is the 8th lecture in a series of lectures for Political Science 101, Principles of Political Science. And this is the first lecture. We'll be addressing Robert Dahl's book, Modern Political Analysis. The major difference between Huntington's approach to looking at the structure of government and society and Dahl's approach is that Dahl's more interested not in the process so much as the most important element in any political relationship or any structure, and that's power. So for Dahl, it's about understanding this element of power and how power plays itself out in terms of government or governing. So when we think about Robert Dahl, we're thinking about power, and we're thinking about how power comes into play, what its relationship is to the structures that exist, and even, and this is where he and Huntington sort of converge, even how that power plays out at various stages in the modernization process, although Dahl never really addresses, certainly not to the depth that Huntington does, that process in and of itself of modernization. It's clear that the power structures, as we move from a traditional society to a modern society, that those power structures, in order to arrive at modernity, have to, of course, change. And so the power that Dahl is addressing obviously is applicable, or the nature of the power he's addressing is applicable to any particular spot on that movement forward. So if we're going to talk about power, we have to first talk about why we want to analyze it and what a political system really is. So we can just put it in some context. We know from Huntington that there's this process moving forward. We know from Huntington that various stages during that process are important and for various reasons. But again, Dahl is looking at what exactly is the relationship between power and that process. So obviously, in order to do his analysis, take his approach, we have to define what power is, obviously, and we have to get a sense of what a political system is, because that's the venue in which it's going to operate. Okay, in short, let's talk about what politics is. Politics is really about who gets what, when, and how. When you think about political structures, really that's what they're deciding. I don't care if you're looking at the courts or the executive branch of a government or perhaps local government. Fundamentally, they're writing legislation and they're executing laws that determine who gets what. Now, the what could be a good, a service, it could be a tax break. If you take out the function of deciding who gets what, you really don't have a political structure. Think about this. Think about during the process of modernization, you have to already have something in place, right? That the thing that's going to be moving forward. That thing that has to be in place is some sort of governing body. And we form these governments because we believe, as I said before, that it's to our advantage to do so, that our lives are going to be better off in terms of life, liberty, and property. So governments decide about those things. Liberty has elements to it. Property certainly has elements to it. What I mean by elements, there are things that make up liberty. Speech, part of being, living in a liberal society. So liberty is key. Now, keep in mind that for the most part, we're talking about, life, liberty, and property in the American system. When you think about why that might be, is because, and I mentioned this before, America is really on the cutting edge of democracy. No one has been out this far. No other democracy has managed to get this far down the road, and so we're really operating in a very unique environment. There are some that would say that once the Constitution of the United States was drawn up and voted on and accepted, and the Declaration of Independence, obviously that came before that, was written, that at that moment what came into existence was this idea of the people. It appears in numerous places in both documents, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So when we talk about power, we're really talking about the context of a democracy. That's what we're most interested in. And if we deviate from that, I'll certainly note that we're deviating from it. And particularly the American democracy, because as I've said, it is the oldest democracy, and a democracy that a lot of other countries have modeled themselves after that have become democratic. And since the American movement towards a democratic society, there have been, and we were the first, there have been now any number of nations that have moved in the direction or are democratic in nature. So a political system is one that determines who gets what. Now, in a democracy, there are different rules around that, rules that are governed by law and the Constitution, certainly. So, yeah, we have monarchs, and they decide who gets what, but the system is different, right? There's no built-in process where the people really necessarily are involved in determining who gets what. That's not to say the American system is perfect. It is to say, however, that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are really, really important documents because nothing had ever, been structured like that. There had never been anything else like them. It's hard to imagine that, and I think we forget that, and so somehow we discount it. But at the moment that those things came into being, they were very special. It had not happened before. And when I say it had not happened before, in any way in which it could really sustain itself. There were various attempts, didn't last very long. So the fact that the United States has managed to get this far down the road is pretty impressive. So a political system is really, politics is about who gets what, but a political system is one where more than two actors interact to pursue their own interests, right? Constrained by what? Constrained by those interests, and sanctified by vested authority based in personal charisma, historic precedent, traditional values, enforced by threat or implementation of sanctions, legitimized by, in accordance with vested authority and or by force. So a political system has a couple of elements here, right? It has people pursuing their own interest. Obviously, you have no system unless there is something going on in that system, and that's what's going on. They're pursuing their own interest. But those interests are contained, right? Those interests, right, are structured within some sort of authority, some sort of structure. And that authority allows and sanctifies those interests to proceed in whatever way they're going to proceed. In other words, as I seek my own ends and you seek yours, there's a structure in place and someone or someones that make a determination about what and how we each can pursue our own ends. Now, presumably, there would be no need for a political system at all if there was never going to be any conflict. You pursue your interests and I pursue mine. Presumably, at some point, our interests are going to cross, and my interests are not consistent with yours. And the granting of my interests over yours creates, obviously, some sort of conflict. So conflict is built in as well. So you pursue what you want, I pursue what I want. There's some sort of authority in place in the system that then makes a determination when there's conflict. And even when there's not, actually, but most importantly, when there's conflict, how that gets resolved. There's the rule of law, there are things in place, and of course we go to those things, but someone has to make the determination about how those things are applied, right? So when we think in terms of a political system, we're really thinking of three individual pieces. Interaction, one or more players, otherwise you've got no system. And what they're doing is pursuing their own interests, second element, right? If they're not pursuing anything, we don't need a system. They're pursuing their own interests, and those interests, right, happen within a structure, right? And that structure is an authority, right? And that authority is based on something. And we know values and the like come into that. And that they're the ones that make the decision, right? They legitimize, right, the action that's taking place. And they're responsible then also for punishing those in some way that would be consistent with the breach as they've determined it, as those leaders or as those that have the authority see fit. In the United States, there's a legal system, there's due processes, as you well know, and so there's a structure in place for dealing with, obviously, this conflict, and every nation has to have it. Again, otherwise there's no point in having the nation. So for Dahl, trying to understand those elements, the conflict, right, the way in which it gets resolved, those are all functions of how power is structured within that society and how it's executed and exercised. So when you think about power, you have to think in terms of more than just one idea. In other words, oftentimes we throw around power, influence, authority, and in most people's minds it means the same thing. If we allow ourselves to think of all of those terms as meaning the same thing, we lose a level of granularity about those particular types of power, and that granularity is really important for understanding power. What it is capable of doing, given what type of power it is. So again, if you think on a continuum, not unlike Huntington's, from modern, traditional rather to modern society, but if you think on a continuum of, what power is the least effective, or and which power is the most effective, if you will, we need some sort of way to assess that. And so we think in terms of, okay, well, what makes me powerful? Well, one way that's appropriate to look at that is, well, suppose I don't have to invest any resources at all. My time, my money, nothing. I don't have to invest any resources, and people will do exactly what I want them to do, right? That's an awful lot of power. Think about that. If I just said something and people would do it, or better still, if people were so concerned about what I wanted that they were trying to come to terms with what I wanted without me even saying it, and then they would do that, that makes me very powerful. Why? Low resource investment, high return. It's like putting no money into the stock market or in the markets and becoming a billionaire based on not putting any money in. It seems nonsensical to us. So that kind of power is very, very rare. You might want to think of it in terms of the way people perceive God, right? We are trying to constantly think of what God wants us to do. Now, I understand that not everybody believes in God, but the point is that God's a great example of someone that has power in people's lives, and that entity, God, really needs to do absolutely nothing. People are always questioning, what does God want? And then they go ahead and do it. Now, if in fact that's what God wants, God's invested no resources, and people are trying to figure out what God wants. And that's pretty powerful, as you all know. So it makes sense for us to break down this idea of power into these various different types of power. And by doing that, we'll have a better understanding of the resources involved in each and their level of effectiveness. So if we think of that continuum, we want to think in terms of, what would come first. In other words, what would require the least amount of resources, right? And the maximum return. Resources in, right, return of, in terms of what you want out. So political influence really is about different forms of influence or power. So let's think of power now, not necessarily as the key word here. And that sounds strange, but let's say that power is a category and that there's a continuum of different types of power, and that each of these involves resources and outcomes. Resources in, outcomes out. Those outcomes are based on having someone do what you want them to do. Now, go back to the context of, this conflict, right? Interacting system, interest, right? Constrained by the interest of others and the like. Imagine if my interests were always met over everybody else's, and I had to do nothing. That would make me, very, very powerful. And therefore, the most powerful sort of place to be is at the beginning, right? The highest form, lowest amount of resources, highest return, and we call that control. Control is a type of power. And if I can control you without any resources, I have a great deal of power. That means that ultimately, I'm going to get you to do what you'd like to do. Now, you'll notice something. The very first and most powerful element, piece, subgroup of power, is one where little resources go in and you have a maximum return. The reason why it's so important and it carries the greatest amount of power is because of the resource and output structure we've put in place, which is reasonable and a very good way of judging who has what power to do what. Okay, so we're going to move through these various subgroups of power, and there's a divide. There's a point at which the power structure that's in place, the types of power, they move from they move into a physical realm from a non-physical realm. And what I mean by that is the resources utilized as we move towards having less and less power. The resources utilized are lower in the beginning, and they increase towards the end. And obviously, the more resources you need, the less powerful you are. Okay, so if we think of control, for whatever reason, culturally, historically, there is a legitimacy to the person or thing that has that sort of, power. Right? Control is typically based on traditional values. We believe what we believe. And oftentimes people don't step away from that and look back at it and say, okay, why do I believe that? Well, we're brought up in a certain environment. We have a certain set of values, right? A set of things that we believe, a moral structure, right? A structure of justice. Democracy is something we believe in. The American way is something we believe in. The work ethic, Protestant work ethic, is something that we believe in. We don't really know why, just that over time, this has been put in place by succession of people and events. And so it makes us American because that's our structure. Americans are uniquely tied to their value system and their culture, just as every nation is. And it's that structure, right, that helps us determine the value of things. Right? If we believe that it's good to take care of our parents as they age, that's an important part of our culture, right? And if someone does that, then that person is rewarded. And if someone does not, that person is, to use a harsh word, scorned. We all tend to conform because we want to be accepted in that society. Think just in your small group of friends. There's a structure there. There's more than two people, and they have different wants and needs, but there's a structure. And believe it or not, that structure is based on the same values as the larger national structure, because all the subgroupings, right, carry the same value system. Now, there's a slight deviation from this, but it's mostly people or generations, I should say, trying to be different in some way, but they're still stuck with the same values. They still live by the same values. Typically, what a new generation brings to the society is a new vocabulary, different words, makes them feel unique, and different types of music, again, makes them feel unique and alike, and a set of subcultures. But all of that stuff is still tied to the same value system. Think about new music. It's there to make money. It's the Protestant work ethic. Right? Everything is tied to that. And so, yes, that generation may feel somehow special. And typically, as enough time passes, give it 30, 40, 50 years, and that generation looks back at specialized language that made it feel different than or different from their parents' generation. They look back on it and, with some, embarrassment, if you will, or, some sense of, wow, were we innocent? Now, you may all be too young to know this word, and I don't know. It may be something you're familiar with, but the '60s generation had a word, groovy. There's going to be a time, right, or there came a time really when that seemed almost childlike to bring up, and the like. Some words have managed to survive, like cool, right? Others not so much. Well, that's what happens, right? But you're really not different. You're really conforming to that structure of new generation, new lingo. You feel sort of separate and different than everyone else, and that's what the young want. Now, that's not to say the culture doesn't change and that there aren't these seminal events that really change the direction of the culture. Certainly in the 1960s, the Vietnam War and quote unquote the sexual revolution, and of course the inevitable. And I say inevitable because when you think about the advancement of human beings, there's no other way to have moved or kept things the way they were. But civil rights, for minority groups and also for women, those were put in place. And typically there was an evolution that moved us into that space, and it's become a part of the culture today, but we're still arguing and still trying to figure out exactly how those things fit in. We know that, we talk about civil rights, those things are very important, but bringing everybody into the fold, so to speak, requesting, looking for, seeking different interests for the first time, way back in the '60s, caused all kinds of upset in the society. But that's how societies grow. And it's not so much that there's going to be upset as it is how those upsets are going to be dealt with as there's competing wants, desires, and interests. Okay, so control is a great thing. You don't have to use any resources. In a democracy, control is pretty much unacceptable. There are icons, and if they say something, it carries a lot of currency. But for the most part, in a democracy, the word control or the idea of control seems sinister and is contrary to our value system. And it makes sense, right? A democracy is about the people. And if the people are not truly free because someone's controlling them, then you really can't call it a democracy. But that doesn't change the fact that that kind of influence is or control is really important. Think about the Pope for a minute. The Pope has control. The Pope expends very little resources, but has a great deal of power. Now, to the flock, not that power doesn't extend to everyone, but a great deal of control about what Catholics will find acceptable or not acceptable. Certainly, I think we can all agree that the Pope is more powerful than, say, myself. it's very easy to see who has power. Why? Because they're exercising it. And how do we know they're exercising it? They're throwing in some resources. Maybe the president, for example, is making a speech, and there's an outcome. People all of a sudden, think it's important that we address a particular issue. Or even look at the First Lady, not just, in the present, but all First Ladies. Typically, they have great influence, mostly because it's consistent with American values. They're really not political beings seeking their own advancement. So if you think about the issues that various First Ladies have been involved in, they've really influenced the society. Now, it's not control, but we give them this power of some kind, and they're able to use that to influence the society. The young, back in the 1960s, they also influenced because there were things going on that really impacted them. And they were trying to break free of their post-World War II parents who had a very set ideas about how you behave, what you should do, what makes you an American. And they try to, move away as they do. What did they do? They changed their clothes, they grew their hair. Their sexual revolution, everywhere where sex was now accepted, and it was not something you spoke about in quiet, but rather you were free, and that having that, the sexual revolution was a way of, sticking your thumb in the eye of the previous generation, saying we're not uptight like you. We're not afraid to express ourselves and our feelings. Of course, that's great for the young, but as time goes on, there are practical concerns and issues around sexual freedom. And the advent of medicines and birth control, of various kinds, allowed that revolution to move on. And now today we don't really think of it so much. It's not as big an issue. I don't think today's generation is going to make a concerted effort that they should have more sexual freedom. We don't really think about it anymore. We think about responsible sex. We know you're going to do it. We know that no one's going to argue about your right to do it other than the rules that have been set in place about age and the like. So we're past that. So these movements do have an effect. But the 60s generation became, when it became the generation that moved in to control the government, right? They were involved in the process. They were pretty much like those that came before them. I would say in certain ways, not as good. They weren't. They became more partisan. They became more, self-serving. They viewed America differently. I'll give you an example. When the 60s generation came to power, one of the things they did not like, and one of the things they wanted to change, was the power structure around money. Getting money and who could receive money and that sort of thing. Well, they put certain constraints on them when they came to power, but they did not allow those constraints, right, to be placed on them. Very political in nature, right? Congress is very good about making up rules that apply to everyone else, but not to Congress. And Congress, of course, as all things are in a democracy like America's democracy, all things that come to pass are always couched, because this is our culture, in terms of doing things that are good for the people. The thing that we've learned about democracy is people doing good things for citizens oftentimes is not about doing good things for the citizens, but you have to couch it in those terms. Everything has to be couched in terms of this is good for the American public. You cannot say this is good for this group. So America plays that game all the time, where if we're going to take any rights away from you, it's typically done in a way that is justified because we're saying we're trying to protect those rights. All right, so when we talk about power, then we're talking about control. Again, very few resources, large outcome. Societies are very good at creating the situation where the culture, the values, all support that. So we turn over a lot of power to those individuals that we've gone ahead and put into positions of power. All right, so as we move along, Authority is the next. The next most effective type of power, because again, it takes some more resources. You have to get elected, or you have to, in some way, earn the respect of others. You have to be seen as someone that can be depended upon, or that is insightful about something, or that's relevant, or is able in some way to move the ball forward. Experience, that sort of thing. So authority takes that sort of history, or getting those sorts of qualifications, or earning those sorts of qualifications, or earning that sort of respect, that people will follow you. People will turn to you. People will expect you to lead in some way. We do that a lot in America because with the fundamental form, which is money. In other words, that's the fundamental way in which most Americans perceive someone having something to bring to the table. So if someone's wealthy, we tend to think that they're better positioned in some way to lead than might otherwise be the case for someone else. So authority has this investment of resources. You have to let people know what you know. You have to win elections or become wealthy, something along those lines. But authority doesn't require a great deal of resources compared to other forms of power. When you compare it to control, and nothing can be compared to control, but because it's just a given. It's a given going in. So authority, when compared to control, obviously is a lot more resources, but it's the other remaining types of power, it requires the least. The next is influence. Now, influence is different than authority. It means that someone you respect, or someone that you value, or someone that makes a very cogent argument, might be able to influence you, get you to do some things. But again, it's not control, and it's not authority. It's not power that you've turned over to them for whatever reason, but you respect them. You know they're well-intentioned. And so you can be influenced by that. An environmental group, and you may not know much about or care much about the environment, let's say, but an environmental group may come across to you as being caring and concerned about all of us, and that might influence you. So we're influenced by a host of things, too many to certainly categorize, and it changes from time to time. But typically, it's the first time where it's really an appeal to your emotions or to your intellectual connection to your emotions that people that have influence are utilizing. All right, so when we talk about influence, then, we're talking about people, sort of your parents, your friends, maybe your teachers, maybe your colleagues, people that you trust and that whose opinions you respect. But there again, that takes more resources on their part. Parents have to demonstrate over and over again that they're reliable, that their advice is good advice. They have to reassure their children that they love them, they care about them, that sort of thing. So it takes a lot more to keep influence. More resources are used in order to have influence. If you go back to the child-parent relationship, the parents' influence will wane as the child becomes older. A teenager, then a young adult, and an adult. Their parents' influence typically diminishes. So unlike authority, which can stay with someone for their entire life, or certainly control, influence can ebb and wane. It can move in, it can move out, depending upon, in terms of influence, in terms of power rather, based upon how much influence that person might have. Next is persuasion. Now, persuasion is different than influence and authority, and certainly control, because persuasion takes a real effort. Now you're investing real resources. You're making the effort to convince somebody, to persuade them, to meet their argument head on and try and counter it, or in some way move them in some direction. And so you spend time, and you have to make an investment of your time and your efforts to try and get them to come to your side of the argument. So persuasion takes more resources. Now, you notice up to this point, what happens is the resources outside of control, again, that we're investing here, are really about time. how much time we put in, and how well we're viewed or respected by others. These things are intangible. That you can't set, how many hours before someone has authority, how many hours of effort. But it takes resources of time. It takes resources of, effort. It takes resources in order to get you to that position where you have authority or where you can influence others. Or certainly just the persuading of people takes time and effort. So up to this point, the resources are growing, the amount of resources you're putting in, and the return on those resources is becoming less certain. In other words, control, no resources, outcome certain. When you move to authority, resources invested, outcome fairly certain, because typically there's a system behind that authority that supports it, that in some ways protects it. So if you're the President of the United States, for example, you have the Congress and the courts, and you have the structure of governance that supports your decisions. And people, by electing you, have given you that authority. So it takes more resources, and although the outcome isn't certain, the outcome is highly probable. When we move to influence, lots of resources again, but here again, the problem is that over time, that influence could wane. As I said, as an example, the parent-child relationship, things change. Someone can, not influence you as much anymore. Maybe you've become more knowledgeable than them in a particular field where they influenced you. But influence tends to break away, not necessarily as a certainty, but it can. Whereas control never does, and authority lasts for a very prescribed period of time typically. When you get to persuasion, this may be momentary. The outcome is completely uncertain. You could spend a great deal of time trying to persuade someone, and it may turn out that you can't persuade them at all. So the outcome is really uncertain. So you've got a lot of resources to dump in time and effort, and there's no real certainty of the outcome. But all of these so far, all these power terms, all these subcategories of what we call power, have all really had minimal investment when you compare them to the next group. We can divide these areas of power really into, if you will, two groups. One, the psychological, and the other is the physical. So the psychological is obviously the control, the authority, the influence, the persuasion. You're trying to appeal to intellect or emotion, and this is not anything other than psychological and emotional terrain that we're working in. No one's dying. And as you can see, the power outcome, or the outcome of the use of those different types of power, is becoming less certain, and the resources are moving up. In other words, as we move from control through authority, influence, and then persuasion, more resources are being used. And again, when it's the non-physical realm, those resources are usually time and effort, right? Those things are becoming more and more uncertain. So we've got resource investment going up and outcome, certainty going down. But when we cross that line to the physical realm, something very interesting happens. Turns out we invest a lot more in resources, not just emotional and psychological, but now physical resources, money, troops, all kinds of things that we need in order to, have our power, sort of laid upon other folks, our power getting the outcome we want with other people. So the first of these, as we cross over, and there's only three, is might. This is typically, as an example that you've probably been exposed to, moving your ships near someone else's nation. Typically, it's just a naval exercise or a military exercise. You're not trying to threaten anyone. But what you're doing is you're saying, look at what we have here. Look at how powerful we are. You might want to rethink your position on X or Y. When the British came during the Revolutionary War, they put so many ships into the Hudson River that you could literally, as the story goes, walk from New York to New Jersey across these boats without ever touching water. And the idea was, look at how big the British Armada is. Do you really want to take us on? So the idea about might is sort of the purpose of it is to really stick out your chest and say, here's our arsenal. Do you really want to challenge us? At this point, you're not really going to the next step yet, which is coercion. That has a different feel to it, which we'll get to. So here, you're investing more time, more effort, more resources, because you're moving things around. You're making that effort to demonstrate. So to put it on a personal level, might is sort of, if there's a conflict between two people, might is sort of trying to get the other person psychologically to back down by exhibiting some sort of formidable, challenge, right? It's akin to what happens in the animal kingdom, and it's very close to coercion, but it's not exactly there yet. The idea is, let's nip this in the bud. I'm not going to use any of my physical resources if I don't have to. I'm going to show them, but I'm still trying to get things to happen the way I want them to happen by sort of appealing to the psychological and the emotional element here. But nevertheless, I'm not doing it through reason. I'm doing it through possible, force, show of force at least. The next one is coercion, which takes a lot more resources. The outcome is even more uncertain than it is with might. Coercion is, all right, now I'm not only sticking out my chest, I'm not only working on the psychological, the emotional level, I'm also now taking a step, and I'm being very direct. We're making it very clear that it's not a naval exercise, and that we've moved these ships, and we've made the policy clear that we're moving these ships because we're concerned about this country's policy or how this country might act. The idea here is it's not just, looking at somebody. Now you're actually threatening them. And it's a very clear difference when you move from showing might or that sort of thing into coercion. You're making a conscious effort to make the threat very real. The threat very real. Whereas with might, you're just laying it out there as a possibility. But with coercion, you're ratcheting it up. And so it's very clear to those on the other side what your intent is if you persist in the behavior that you have. The sort of street example of this is you're moving from just sticking out your chest to now getting in the other person's face, saying, what are you going to do about it? Now you're trying to coerce. Now you're really stepping it up. More resources. And the outcome is even more uncertain. Why? The other person could walk away and you've coerced them. Or they may not walk away at all, and now you've got to escalate. And that escalation comes at a great cost because there's no certainty at all that you're going to win the day. Right? So coercion is a dicey bit of business because if it fails, you have no choice but to go to the next. Well, you have two choices, right? To be called on it and back down, which is a complete loss of any kind of outcome you want, and sets up future issues and problems for you as others become aware of the fact that you try and coerce, but there's nothing behind it. Or you step it up and you move to the last subdivision of power, which is force. Force takes an incredible amount of resources, not only psychological and emotional, but physical resources. In the case of nations, we're talking guns and planes and bombs and war that can go on for an extended period of time, lives lost, to try and get another nation to do what we want them to do. So actually, force is a failure in terms of the use of power. Why? Well, if you define in terms of resource inputs and favorable outcomes, the use of force has no guarantee at all. You're expending a lot more resources, and the certainty of an outcome that you want is going, if not down, it's certainly not going up. Okay? So you can see that it's very important if we're trying to understand what other nations are doing, or what the players, and this is more to our point, what the players in a nation are doing, those that are struggling for power. You can watch where they are in this continuum and get a sense of what they're willing to do, and how they're trying to gain power, right? So when we're looking at power now, we understand there are different forms of it, But there are certain things that we need to understand about power in order to really understand how it gets used and what it can or can't do. So let's talk about, the parameters of power. First, let's get out of the way a couple of fallacies that people have, a couple of, things that people believe to be true, but in fact, they're not, at least not according to Dahl. The first fallacy is the lump of power fallacy. People often believe that this is an all or nothing game, that you either have power or you don't have power. And that's not the case, because I always have the power to sort of deny you. I have the power to just refuse and not care if you take my life. I'm just not going to do what you want me to do. A nation can go to war and say, we don't care. We'll go at this, and if we lose every single person in the country fighting you, we will. We don't care. So there's a presumption here that people always care, but sometimes they get to the point where they've got nothing to lose. And so no one ever has all the chips. No one ever has all the power. It's not this single, solid, unbreakable, thing that you either have or you don't have. Everybody has some form of power, even if it's just the power to say no. Right? The second sort of fallacy here is confusing power with resources. Okay, now, I just said before that resources are a way in which we measure this. How many resources are you willing to expend to get a certain outcome? That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is confusing the fact that you have resources, right, with your willingness to use them. In other words, we assume if you have the resources, you're going to use them, right? Resources equal power. And it may not at all. You may have all the resources in the world, but they're the wrong resources. They're not the necessary legal arguments you need, let's say. You might have a lot of money, your corporation may have a lot of money, but it doesn't have the legal arguments necessary in order to do what it would like to do. Win the day, have policy change to suit them, that sort of thing. Or you may just decide that I'm not going to go ahead and spend any of my resources. I like having all these resources, but I don't want to do anything with them. Having the resources, such as money and might and power, all that stuff, having the respect of others, all of this doesn't mean you're going to use any of it, right? You can't assume that someone that has resources is willing to use them. So this idea that if you've got resources, you've got power is not necessarily the case at all. The third is confusing power with rewards and deprivations. Okay? If you define influence or power, however you want to break the categories down, as exactly equivalent to the consequences, the allocation of rewards and deprivations, then you're dealing with an empirical question here. In other words, power, does it really depend upon your ability to reward or deprive somebody? Is that what power is? Well, from the breakdown of the various types of power elements, you can see that that's not the case. So we want to get those out of the way, right? This idea of the lump of power and confusing power with resources and confusing power with the ability to reward and deprive people. So what can you conclude from all this? That power does not work this way. It's not lumped together or tied to resources or the result of the ability to punish people or not. Why? People could have power without really having resources. Think of some of the world's great leaders, Mahatma Gandhi, right? If you think about people that have, little or no resources, but managed to change the direction of the country, and Martin Luther King. This is important to keep in mind. Just because they have, no resources does not mean they can't have power. And because they have a lot of resources does not mean they do have power. So keep in mind that power is strange in that way. The power of a Martin Luther King did not come from the resources, the typical resources of money and the like, but it came from a powerful idea and a willingness to sort of structure that idea within the system. That's where the power resided from Martin Luther King. In terms of civil rights, when you look at the way in which the NAACP moved the ball forward. Thurgood Marshall, who headed the NAACP, said, look, if we try and have laws change in this country, it's going to take forever. But if we go at this with the courts, if we win the court decisions, then the other branches of government are going to have to act in concert with that decision. In other words, the easiest point of entry is going to be the courts. And so he was smart enough to understand that the court is not going to change so readily in the way it views things. So we'll get a couple of cases before the court, the Supreme Court. Soften them up a bit. They'll reject us. But eventually we'll bring a case that will give us the best likelihood, the best outcome. And that was Brown versus the Board of Education. So he understood the system, and that's where his power came from. And he had the patience to wait for the right moment. That's a source of, was a source of his power. All right, so when we talk about influence or power or whatever term we're talking about, you have to think in terms of, you have to define that power regardless of what type of power it is. And you have to think of it in terms of, according to Dahl, right, you have to think of it in terms of how we measure it. In other words, is there a way to measure how much power someone has? Okay, we've gotten away from this whole idea of resources, right? We know there's a higher expenditure of them with various subdivisions of power, but we need a way to define how much power someone really has independent of those resources, okay? And so we break power down into, scope and domain. That's two of the places where we really start. What am I talking about here? Well, if we want to know how powerful someone or some group is, we look at their domain. Basically, who's influenced? The number of people, right? If we can see a lot of people being influenced or a lot of people that they're affecting in some way, then that's an important thing in terms of understanding that entity's power, right? So when we talk about, domain, we're talking about who's influenced, numbers of people, and the types. So domain is important. Over what domain can their power be exercised? The next is scope. How much are those people that they have domain over influenced? And over what issues? Are they influenced completely or not? Is it over one issue or many? So someone might have the power to influence people in just one area, and that's great. And it may be a lot of people. But if you can influence a lot of people in only one issue, you have less power in whatever type of subcategory of power we're talking about, from control all the way down to force. You have less power than someone that has the same or equal domain as you, but influences people over many different types of issues, right? So if I can influence the same number of people as you, but I can do it over more issues, then I have more power. Why? I can get more people to do what I'd like them to do. I can get more likely I'm going to have the outcome I want because I have so much more power or influence or whatever it might be. So the third here is going to be breadth. How long do I have that power over them? How long can I, have authority or influence, right? How long can I demonstrate might? Now, how long, right? So the period of time is important. So it's not just who I influence or over how many issues, but for how long, right? And then there's depth, which is really an interesting one. It's a bleed over sort of effect. How many other acts are influenced by your act? In other words, how many other spillovers or spillover effects are there? So, for example, if I convince Americans they should really care about the environment, that could move into them also caring about family life. So that one particular issue could bleed into other issues as people make comparisons between that issue, say the environment, and other issues in their life. It may turn out that there's a lot of, depth to your power. So let's make a ridiculous comparison. Again, I like to use God because it's, if you believe in God, well, even the concept of God is ultimate power, right? So let's talk about domain. If you believe there's a God, in the present sort of structure of the world, it's a lot of people that are influenced. And now I'm not saying religion, I'm saying God. So whatever the religion is, if it's one that's based on a deity, then there is a God, and that God is going to probably influence a lot of people, right? Let's compare God to me. I don't influence a lot of people. I don't have control over a lot of people, really no one. I don't have, a lot of power at all. So my domain is very, very small, very small. Scope. Well, God can influence people over so many issues. The way they live their life, from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed. Everything they think about and the way they structure their lives is based on what they think God wants. I mean, this is control, right? So what about me? I don't really have a whole lot of influence in terms of issues. What issues I mean, right now, as you take this class, I have some authority because you've given it to me. I have some influence because basically you're saying, okay, this person knows what they're talking about and makes a reasonable argument. But it's for a very short period of time, the length of time of the semester, and it's basically just this issue, right? So the breadth is also short on my part. Period of time, very short. God, very long. People's entire lives, right? Then there's depth. How many other acts does the person influence, or does the entity influence? Now here, I do a little bit better, because it's possible that some people may take what I say in a class and apply it to other issues in their lives, like the power dynamic between themselves and, say, friends and family. It might bleed over, and so that might have some legs for me. Not a whole lot. I have some. How many other acts are influenced by, that act in terms of God? It just goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. So when we make this ridiculous comparison between myself and, say, God, and again, I'm not trying to compare myself to God and people's concept of it in that way. I'm trying to show you the disparity in power based on domain, scope, breadth, and depth. Now let's give a more practical example of that. Let's talk about the United States and, say, some very small nation with a very small economy and really no military to speak of, and very small, limited population. The domain of the United States, who is influenced by the United States, is pretty vast, on all levels. There is a lot of influence from the United States. That tiny little nation, how does it influence anyone? Their domain is just maybe their own people. The scope over what issues? Probably for that small nation, whoever they're influencing, whoever they have power over in some way, not many issues at all. The United States, you look at our diplomacy and the like, many issues. Breadth, for what period of time? Well, this small nation probably doesn't really have a very long period of time. Maybe it's just situation specific completely. Whereas the United States has been at this for a long time and has really had a great deal of influence since World War II. So it's been pretty long. And how many other acts are influenced by the United States vis-a-vis other nations? A lot. Nations that might want to do certain things but won't because it's problematic in the eyes of the United States. So you can see by looking at domain, scope, breadth, and depth, it becomes a lot clearer that not only do these various power subgroups exist, but that you can measure each one of them in terms of, if you're trying to understand within a subgroup, who has the most influence, for example, or the greatest authority. You would look to see the domain, scope, breadth, and depth of that power. And that would give you a pretty good understanding as to who's got power and who does not. We'll leave it there and we'll pick it up next time.